everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and today we are going to talk about some bodily fluids. I know, so for honestly thousands of years, really, bodily fluids have been considered some of the most potent forms of magic, right? It's energetically directly connected to you. So, obviously, in sympathetic magic, this works in multiple ways. And really, if you take a second to really think about it in at least through your magical lens, you can really see how saliva, tears, and urine have all deeply rooted folk legends, stories, spells, and honestly, way more. And I'm just going to say this now, this episode is not going to be multiple hours long, citing all the wonderful, curious moments of how these bodily fluids worked their way through folklore and especially occult texts. But I do encourage you all to really look into this deeper if you do feel more called to it. And I am going to exclude blood in this one and other fluids of maybe the spicy variety because I really think that those should belong in their own respective episodes. But anyway, let's get talking. So it's not just a quote waste that your body creates or secretes, I should say. Uh, it's your essence. It's really your life force, which is a common term talked about in this way in the practice of blood magic, especially. But it carries your DNA, your hormones, your pheromones, right? It's your electromagnetic signature. So let me give you some examples of how this actually worked in mostly European folk traditions because it's so well recorded, but because this isn't some exotic practice from distant cultures, really. It's actually relevant in many cultures. But let's start with saliva because really it's probably the most widespread and persistent form of body fluid magic in human history, and really for good reason. It's always available. It carries your direct essence, and you could use it to bind, seal, banish, heal. I mean, the possibilities here are really endless. Now, I believe the oldest documented saliva magic goes back to ancient Mesopotamia, where we're talking Assyrian medical texts from the 7th century BCE that describe these healing rituals where practitioners would anoint with saliva of the mouth to transfer this healing power directly from the healer to the patient. So, the Code of Hammurabi actually references contractual agreements, which is sealed with spit. Sounds pretty familiar to, spitting on your hand before a handshake, maybe. So they legally recognized that saliva carried this personal essence and intent. And this really continues throughout history. The Worn Book of Honorius from the 13th century specifies that certain angelic invocations must be moistened with the magician's own spittle to carry this proper authority. And of course, the Key of Solomon describes how ritual implements must be consecrated with water of the mouth to attune them to the practitioner's will. So where it also starts to get a little bit more practical is the long lost friend. This, Pennsylvania Dutch magical text from 1820 contains dozens of charms that require spitting for effectiveness. One healing charm instructed the practitioner to spit 3 times upon the ailing part while reciting the holy words. So really, this showed that they understood that saliva was literally carrying the power of the spoken spell. And even in the sixth and seventh books of Moses, which describe saliva as the water of life that flows from the temple of the soul, and they give specific instructions for using fasting saliva, particularly. So that would be the saliva that you collect when you first wake up, before eating or drinking anything. And this is really for the most maximum magical potency because overnight fasting creates this more consecrated essence, which is super practical and obviously nothing new when it comes to magic and the occult world, really. So, from a magical perspective, your saliva is really just you in liquid form. It carries your essence, your intent, your life force. When you use it in magical work, you're creating this direct energetic connection between yourself and really whatever you're working with. One method that I like to use it for is intention sealing. So, for example, you can spit lightly into your palm and use that moisture to blend herbs, like by rubbing both of your hands together. And this really creates almost like a less wet poultice that you can then apply to candles or really use it for anything else that might need anointing. And you can use saliva also for scrying. This is probably less heard of, but because it combines, this type of pattern divination with your personal essence, like spitting on a black mirror or a dark surface, and then reading the patterns it creates as it dries, you're sort of reading the movement of your own life force. And something really wild from the Picatrix, medieval Arabic magicians would mix their saliva with specific metals during planetary hours to create what they called these living talismans. So they would spit on copper during Venus hours to enhance love magic, or on iron during Mars hours for protection. And the saliva was believed to like animate the metal with the magician's life force, which I think is really, really cool. So saliva is fantastic for protection too. And I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with this, but spitting on a threshold for warding or for banishing or warding off the evil eye, which is very popular in some cultures in Eastern Europe, Greece, Italy. And I mean, if you really think about it, something that's been happening forever is spitting into someone's face as an insult. Most people let this go just really without thinking of the magical potencies it's really gained over centuries of use. And saliva actually works wonders for cursing too. Many people might think that since it's connected to you, it would somehow intertwine your energy with the curse and create some sort of backfire effect, but actually it amplifies that energy like crazy. Just think about that instinctive rage of spitting in someone's direction after they piss you off. So now let's move on to tears. Tears are your emotions made manifest in physical form. When you feel something intensely enough, your body produces a physical substance that carries that emotional energy. In medieval European folk traditions, people were so sophisticated about this that they collected and even categorized tears based on the emotion that produced them. So, for example, tears of joy could go into love spells and celebration rituals. Tears of grief or could be incorporated into banishing work and ending spells. And tears of rage, now those were, could be used in justice magic and protection work. Laknanga, which is, this Anglo-Saxon medical and magical text from around 1000 CE, describes collecting tears of the sorrowful mother for protection charms. But really, here's the key. The text specifically says these tears must be freely given, not forced, because the magical power comes from the authentic emotion behind them. And in the Scottish Highland traditions, documented by Alexander Carmichael, there are records of women collecting their tears during childbirth in small vials. And, these birth tears were then used later for protection magic specifically for their children. And the reasoning was that birth tears contained the mother's fierce protective love in this concentrated form. And modern research has actually validated this to a point. Different emotions produce tears with completely different chemical compositions. Tears of sadness contain higher levels of stress hormones like cortisol, and tears of joy contain different neurotransmitters. Hell, even tears from cutting onions have a totally different chemical makeup than emotional tears. And this means your tears are carrying the biochemical signature of whatever emotion produced them. From a magical perspective, this makes them incredibly potent for sympathetic magic work. And you can use tears for grief, like I said, for banishing or release work, because they carry the energy of letting go. When you're doing magic to end something, perhaps a relationship, a habit, or a situation that maybe no longer serves you, adding your own tears of sadness creates a powerful sympathetic link to the energy of release. And tears of joy, those are really gold for a manifestation and even love magic because they carry the vibrational frequency of happiness and fulfillment. If you want to attract more joy into your life, then, tears shed during moments of genuine happiness can be even more powerful spell components. Save them from weddings, graduations, births, any moment when you're overwhelmed with positive emotion. And this might be a little funny, but I'm just like picturing sitting in the pews of a wedding and just pulling out a really cool ancient looking little vial and just holding it under your eyes. You're like crying for whoever's getting married or graduating. A very, very witchy thing to do. But, tears of anger, those are fierce medicines for justice work and boundary setting because they carry the energy of righteous in divination. So, when you're doing magic to protect yourself or others, when you're working for justice or trying to stop harmful behavior, those tears of rage can add an emotional sort of intensity that can make your magic devastatingly effective. And you can use tears for healing emotional wounds too, because, they represent the physical manifestation of processing difficult emotions. It's this alchemy that's happening. Create a ritual where you consciously cry over a bowl. Again, might look really funny, but also very, very witchy. Just like hold out cauldron and cry into it. you know, then you can use these tears to water plants or create a ritual bath. You're feeding your healing process with the physical evidence of your emotional work. So now let's talk about urine. And if you know about witch bottles, you already know about pee. And for thousands of years, across virtually every magical tradition on Earth, urine was considered one of the most powerful magical substances available. There's just so much substance here when you really look into the old texts, and particularly first morning urine. The Papyrus Ebers, an ancient Egyptian medical text from 1550, I believe, describes using the water of the rising. It sounds so mystical, but that's morning urine, for protection spells and healing rituals. The text specifies that this must be the first urine upon waking before eating and drinking because it contains the consecrated essence of overnight regeneration, much like the saliva. And in medieval European grimoires, urine appears very, very consistently. The Munich Manual of Demonic Magic from the 15th century describes using the practitioner's own waters. I swear, they used anything but just the word piss. But I digress. So it was used to create protective circles and consecrate ritual spaces, which this pops up in multiple texts around the world. But, the reasoning was that your urine contains, of course, your essence in concentrated form, and it's literally been filtered through your entire body. So there's a German folk magic text as well. I'm really not even going to try to pronounce it here, but from the 16th century contains detailed instructions for using morning urine in scrying work as well. So practitioners would urinate into a dark bowl at sunrise particularly and read the patterns and reflections for divination. They understood that you were literally looking into your own life force really for answers. It's your blood that has been filtered through your kidneys. Your kidneys process your entire blood supply multiple times a day, extracting waste, but also concentrating your essence. And from a magical perspective, urine is, again, this life force in a purified, concentrated form. So, morning urine is particularly powerful because, again, it's that kind of fasting mentality. It's been concentrating in your bladder all night while your body was in this regenerative sleep mode. And I think that's probably the most like relevant thing here is whether you're using first morning saliva, first morning even tears, and first morning urine. It is specifically made from that regenerative sleep mode. And there's nothing else to disrupt it. There's no food, there's no drink, and it contains hormones, cellular waste products, and what alchemists call the salt of the body, your physical essence in liquid form. So the Emerald Tablet of Hermes speaks of that which is below is like that which is above. Your urine represents the below, the physical manifestation of your body's processing and purification systems. When you work with it magically, you are working with this internal alchemy. And again, back to the Scottish Highland traditions, there are records of people using their morning urine to create these protective barriers around their homes. And I'm sure it is nothing new from just watching maybe wild wolves or their dogs piss around their territory. They would walk the perimeter of their property at sunrise, marking the boundaries with small amounts of urine. This created what they called a life circle, this protection powered by their own essence. And German folk healers documented in Jacob Grimm's collections, yes, the Grimm, like Grimm brothers, would use urine for what they called return to sender magic. And this is pretty cool. If someone was being cursed or hexed, they would collect their first morning urine for 9 days, then use it to create a mirror spell that would send the negative energy back to its source. And in the folk traditions of rural England, documented in collections like those by Cecil Sharp, There are accounts of using urine in fertility magic, and women trying to conceive would water specific plants with their morning urine during certain moon phases, understanding that they were feeding the earth with their own creative essence. And you can use morning urine for protection work because it creates an energetic barrier infused with your personal essence. It's the perfect warding oil. But talking about oils, a few drops of it added to protection oils is even more um, potent. I don't expect anyone to actually take a jar full of pee and pour it around their perimeter of their home. But if you do, you know what? That's up to you. But you can add a few drops into your oils or sprinkled around your property, which creates a boundary that's specifically attuned to you and your energy. And nothing can cross that barrier without your permission because it's made from your own life force. So the power of all these body fluid magics comes from the same principle. This sympathetic magic, like affects like. Your saliva is connected to you, so anything it touches becomes connected to you. Your tears carry your emotional state, so they can transmit that emotional energy to your magical workings. And your urine contains your filtered essence, so it can create protective boundaries for divine insights that are specifically yours. It's just that simple, but it's pretty profound. So now that we've established how powerful and widespread body fluid magic is, I kind of want to talk about what happened to it because this isn't just ancient history. It's more or less about understanding how maybe Christianity or other, Abrahamic faiths might have systematically stripped you of your most intimate magical practices and really replaced them with maybe more watered down priest controlled substitutes, or at least made you think of how fucking vile and devilry it might be to use such ingredients. This takeover wasn't accidental, of course. It was very strategic, deliberate, and incredibly effective, like many other things in the realm of this discussion. And the early church fathers understood something very crucial. If you want to control people spiritually, you have to make them dependent on external sources for their power. You can't have, people walking around knowing that their own spit, tears, and piss are more magically potent than anything a priest can offer them. So let's start with holy water. Think about this for a second, because instead of using your own saliva, which carries this personal essence that we talked about, you're supposed to use water that's been blessed by a priest who may have never even met you. And the water has no connection to your body, your energy, or your personal magical practice. In fact, it is absolutely supposed to be purified. It's not even connected to where it came from. Now, don't get me wrong here, holy water absolutely has its place in magical work, and it's highly effective as well for many, many things. But in its connection directly to using your own bodily fluid, I want to talk about her in a different light today because using holy water for magic is a whole different topic and discussion. But you know what? Maybe this week, actually, I'll put down a poll uh, for, a few ideas for upcoming episodes. And really, I would love to hear from you all. Okay, anyway, back to the program before I get sidetracked. The first recorded use of holy water in Christianity appears in the 4th century, right around the time when the church was aggressively suppressing these folk magic practices. Pope Alexander I supposedly instituted the practice, but what's interesting is how closely it mirrors the older traditions of sacred fluid use. You sprinkle it for protection, you use it for blessing, you consume it for purification, even. It sounds pretty familiar. In this way, holy water removes your personal agency from the equation, and you can't make it yourself. You have to get it from a priest. Obviously, today you can make your own kind of holy water, but anyway, you have to sort of trust that his blessing is more powerful than your own bodily essence. You become dependent on the church for something that you could essentially provide for yourself. Now, baptism is probably the most brilliant example of how Christianity co opted body fluid magic. And I know baptism is not just a Christian thing. It's technically christening, and baptism is for Catholicism, but in pre-Christian traditions, birth itself was understood as a sacred fluid event. The amniotic fluid that surrounded you in the womb, the blood of birth, the first tears you cried, all of this was seen as powerfully magical, marking your entry into the world as a spiritual being. Birth workers and midwives would collect these and use these birth fluids in protective magic for the newborn, placenta was even buried with ceremony, and the umbilical cord was saved for protective amulets or charms. And your actual birth process was honored as a magical event where your body produced sacred substances. You are not only growing another human, you grew an entire new organ. So Christianity replaced all of this with this baptism ritual, where you're dunked in or sprinkled with ordinary water. I know it's not super ordinary, but that a priest has blessed instead of honoring the magical fluids your body actually produced during birth. You're told you need to be born again through a completely artificial ritual that removes your parents, your body, your actual birth experience from the equation. And really what's really fucking cool that I love is this historical record of actually documented organized efforts by accused witches to ritually reverse their Christian baptisms. The trial records from the North Berwick witch trials in Scotland, which was like 2 years in 1590 to 1592, include testimony of practitioners performing what they called an unbaptism ceremony, where they would immerse themselves in the sea while renouncing their Christian names and reclaiming their true names given by the devil, which were often just their pre Christian family names or nicknames. And of course, in the Malleus Maleficarum, documents very similar practices, describing how some accused witches claim to have washed away the stain of baptism in natural bodies of water while reciting backwards versions of the baptismal vows. And Henrik Kramer was particularly disturbed by reports of women gathering at springs and rivers to perform these reverse rituals because, oh my God, I'm sure if a man was out hunting and came across a stream full of naked women unbaptizing themselves, it would just be so horrific. But understanding that they were deliberately undoing the spiritual control that baptism was meant to establish. And furthermore, French witch trials records from the 16th and 17th centuries contain multiple accounts of practitioners using what they called the devil's baptism, which involved full immersion in natural water while explicitly rejecting Christian doctrine. These weren't random acts of rebellion, but organized ritual practices that seem to have been passed down through folk magical traditions. And the participants understood that they were reclaiming spiritual autonomy that had been taken from them, really without any consent as infants. Okay, so really what makes this so psychologically damaging is that, Christianity didn't just ban body fluid magic. They replaced it with versions that kept you dependent. They provided the alternative, such as, turning old gods into the new one with the big red scary adversary. And this created a psychological pattern that goes way deeper than just magical practice. It's about learning to distrust your own body, your own wisdom, your own innate spiritual power. It's about becoming dependent on institutions instead of sovereign in your own spiritual practice. And that dependency is exactly what organized religion needed to maintain power. Well, needs present day. So, we've talked about how Christianity strategically replaced your body fluid magic with priest controlled alternatives, but that was only half of the strategy. The other half was much more insidious. They had to make you actively disgusted by your own body's natural functions, because it's not enough to offer substitutes if people still remember that their own fluids are powerful. You have to create a deep psychological aversion to your own sacred nature. And this is the part where many people have to relearn. The foundation for this, I guess we'll call it a shame campaign, was laid in the Old Testament with the Levitical purity laws. Now, these laws, they weren't about hygiene or health. They were about creating artificial categories of clean and unclean that had nothing to do with the actual danger and everything to do with control. Suddenly, menstrual blood, which had been revered as the most powerful magical substance for thousands of years, became suddenly unclean. And women on their periods were banished from the temple, forbidden from touching sacred objects, required to undergo purification rituals, not because menstrual blood itself was actually dangerous, but because its power threatened the new patriarchal religious order. So the same thing happened with other bodily functions. Spitting became suddenly associated with only the disrespect instead of power, and urine became obviously waste instead of concentrated life force. And tears became signs of weakness connected to your emotions, instead of this kind of emotional alchemy. But the real psychological damage came from what we now call purity culture, and the idea that your body is inherently sinful and needs constant monitoring, control, and purification. This wasn't just about sexuality, though. It was certainly part of it. This was about teaching you to be fundamentally ashamed of being a physical, fluid producing, biological being, human meat bag. you know, think about the messages you might have received growing up if you were in a Christian household. Your body is a temple, but it's also fallen and corrupt because your natural impulses are sinful. Your bodily functions are embarrassing at best and disgusting at worst. And you need to die to the flesh and focus on spiritual things, the very substances maybe your ancestors considered sacred became sources of shame. And this creates a disconnection from your own physical appearance that makes it so much harder to access your intuition, your emotions, and that personal power that we talk about. When you're trained to be disgusted by your own bodily functions, you lose the ability to recognize them as sources of wisdom and strength. So, as Christianity became more entrenched, it allied itself with the emerging medical establishment to further demonize body fluid magic. What had once been understood as sacred substances were reclassified as waste products and bodily secretions. I mean, really, just even the words, I think, were employed to make you feel a certain way about it. And the language of medicine was used to strip away any sense of sacred from your body's natural functions. Saliva became just spit, something to be swallowed or discreetly expelled. Tears became just lacrimal secretions and voluntary responses to emotional stimuli. And urine, of course, became liquid waste, something to be flushed away as quickly as possible. And the scientific terminology deliberately removed any hint of this sacred potential, power, or magic, really. So, this shame campaign was particularly vicious when it came to women's bodies and the fluids that they produce. Back to the menstrual blood, which had been considered super powerful, it's just this substance throughout human history that has carried so much magic, became the ultimate source of shame and disgust. Women were really taught to hide their periods, to be embarrassed by them, to see them as a curse rather than a blessing. The language around menstruation became euphemistic and shame based, like that time of the month, or the curse, or being just unwell, all designed to disconnect women from the recognition that they were producing the most magically potent substance on earth, basically every month. And birth fluids received very similar treatment. Instead of being honored as sacred substances that marked the transition from spirit to flesh, they became this messy kind of medical situation that needed to be cleaned up and disposed of as quickly as possible. The entire birth process was medicalized and sanitized to remove any hint of its magical nature. And this really doesn't just affect practicing Christians. Even people who have completely left Christianity often carry these shame patterns around their bodies and bodily functions, or even non religious people at all. It's just this stain that it's created on society for so long. The discuss response to body fluid magic isn't natural, it's learned. And it runs so deep that most people don't even question it. When someone recoils from the idea of using their own saliva, tears, or urine in magical practice, that's not their authentic response. That's really centuries of programming telling them that their body is shameful and their natural functions are disgusting, unclean, or just pure taboo. But why? The beautiful thing here is that once you begin to recognize this programming for what it is, you can really start to unlearn it. And that's really what it's about. You can begin to see your body's fluids not as waste or shame, but as the sacred substances that they've always been. You can reclaim the magic that was stolen from you and recognize your physical form as the powerful spiritual tool it actually is. And the reason this shame campaign was so important to Christianity's success is simple. You can't control people who are comfortable with their own power. You, if you truly understood that your body produces sacred substances every day, if you really knew that your tears carry this transformative emotional energy, if you genuinely recognize that your saliva and your urine are more magically potent than any priest can bless for you, then you wouldn't need their institution. by making you ashamed of your own body, by teaching you to see your natural functions as disgusting rather than sacred, by convincing you that you need external purification rather than recognizing your own inherent holiness. They create this psychological dependency that could last for generations, and it has. But the dependency was never real. Your body was sacred before any religion told you it was sinful, and your fluids were powerful before any priest told you that they were shameful. And recognizing the truth is the first step towards reclaiming the magic that really was always yours. So, we've talked about how Christianity systematically replaced your body fluid magic and created this shame around your natural functions. But maybe some of you are thinking, how did this actually happen, or how do we know it actually happened? Where's the evidence? Well, buckle up because I'm going to cite some stuff. And it's really because it's absolutely wild when you start digging into it. So let's start with the grimoires. Or grimoires, sorry. Those, medieval magical texts that somehow survived the church's burning campaigns. And even though these were written during peak Christian dominance, they are absolutely stuffed with body fluid magic. The scribes and magicians couldn't completely erase this knowledge because it was too fundamental to effective magical practice. Some, if not most, actually claiming these spells and charms to ward off witches and the craft itself. So back to the Picatrix, this massive, massive 11th century Arabic grimoire, which was translated into Latin, contains over 40 references to using the magician's own bodily fluids in various operations. It describes collecting saliva during specific planetary hours, like we discussed before, and using tears shed during particular emotional states and incorporating urine into protective circles. And the text treats these as standard magical ingredients, not taboo practices. It's just completely normalized. And back to the sworn book of Honorius from the 13th century, it gets more explicit. It contains, detailed instructions for what it calls operations of the natural body, including using fasting saliva to consecrate angelic seals, collecting tears during prayer for divine communication work, and using morning urine to create protective barriers again around specifically ritual spaces. And this isn't fringe magic, this was mainstream medieval practice at the time. So, even in the witch trial records, because of course, when the church was prosecuting folk healers and cunning folk, they had to document exactly what these people were doing. Whether true or false, most likely the latter. It's very glorified and falsified versions to scare the masses, but could be true. Interesting and creative nonetheless. In the trial records from the Wurzburg, I think that's how you say it, witch hunts in 1620, there are multiple accounts of accused women using their own saliva in healing work. One healer named Anna Limmer was accused of spitting upon wounds while muttering unholy words, which sounds like a lot like the saliva healing practices we discussed earlier, or, even your mom or loved one dampening their finger with saliva to wipe a cut or spot from your face or knee as a kid. And so also the trial of Isabel Gaudy or Gowdy, I hear it different ways, in Scotland back in 1662, which contains her detailed confession about using tears collected during grief for what she called sorrow magic, spells designed to end suffering or release people from painful situations. The court recorded these practices as evidence of diabolic magic. But to anyone familiar with folk traditions, they're clearly this sort of ancient healing technique. Even more telling are the English witch trial records that mention water magic, which practitioners, of course, collected the morning urine for scrying and this protective work. Even in the Pendle witch trials, this includes a testimony about accused witches using the first water of the day for divination. The language is euphemistic, but it's clearly describing urine magic. And back to the Grimms, the brother Grimms, in the Dutch mythology. I don't know how to say it. Contains extensive records of saliva magic among rural practitioners. He documents the practice of spitting on iron tools to prevent rust, spitting on seeds before planting for better harvests, and spitting in the four directions for protection. He notes that these practices were ancient beyond memory and clearly predated Christianity in the region. and the physical evidence is just as compelling. Archaeological excavations across medieval European sites have uncovered specialized vessels clearly designed for collecting and storing bodily fluids for magical purposes. Excavations at the medieval village of Warham, Percy in Yorkshire uncovered small ceramic vessels with narrow openings and internal measurements that suggest that they were designed for collecting tears. Yes, please. I will be adding these on my Christmas list this year. These vessels date to the 12th century and show wear patterns consistent with repeated ritual use. And even German archaeological sites from the medieval period have yielded what researchers call ritual fluid containers. So, these small, carefully crafted vessels with symbols indicating magical use. And even chemical analysis of residue in some of these containers has revealed traces of human saliva and urine, confirming that this was used for body fluid. Magic, maybe, but definitely body fluid. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from, of course, the church's own records of suppression, because they documented their efforts to eliminate these practices, and those records prove how widespread and persistent body fluid magic actually was. Again, in the Malleus Maleficarum, there is this entire section devoted to what it calls abominable practices involving bodily emissions. So, really, the text goes into surprising detail about folk practitioners using saliva, tears, and urine for magical purposes. Detail that only makes sense if these practices were extremely common and well known. So, when you map the timeline of these suppression efforts against the development of Christian replacement rituals, the pattern becomes obvious. Holy water became standardized in the 4th century, right when the first prohibitions against saliva magic started to appear. Baptismal practices became mandatory in the 5th century, coinciding with bans on the birth fluid rituals. And modern scholars who study medieval magic and folk practices are pretty clear about this. By all means, I myself am no scholar, maybe self-taught at best, but I'm not going to give myself any sort of title. But scholars like Richard Kuykefer, who wrote Magic in the Middle Ages, and Owen Davies, author of Popular Magic, both documented the systematic suppression of body fluid magic and its replacement with Christian alternatives. So, anthropologists studying European folk traditions consistently note that body fluid magic appears to be obviously among the oldest and most persistent magical practices, suggesting it predates organized religion entirely. The fact that it survived so long despite intense suppression indicates how fundamental these practices were to human spiritual experience. The evidence is overwhelming once you start looking for it. Body fluid magic wasn't some fringe practice again. It was mainstream. It was really, really common. And it was this sort of spiritual technology that got suppressed and replaced by these institutional alternatives. And the historical record proves it. The archaeological evidence supports it, and the ethnographic documentation confirms it. When you understand this history, it really becomes clear that reclaiming body fluid magic isn't about adopting some new age practice. It's about returning to spiritual technologies that are literally older than civilization itself. And it's about recognizing that your body has always been sacred and your fluids have always been powerful, regardless of what any religion tries to tell you. So, now that we've covered the history, the suppression, and even the academic evidence, I know some of you are thinking, okay, but does this stuff actually work? Or is it just some ancient superstition that got blown out of proportion? Well, because modern science has actually validated a lot of what our ancestors understood intuitively about the power of bodily fluids, let's start with the basics. Just as a forewarning, this is going to be a lot of sciencey stuff, but I really like connecting science to magic in places where it is applicable because I don't know, it just really makes me feel more connected to it. And of course, knowledge is power. So, that being said, there's going to be some sciencey words here, but your bodily fluids aren't just random liquids, right? They're incredibly complex substances that carry massive amounts of information about you. The saliva alone contains over 1,000 different proteins, including your complete DNA sequence, which most people already know. And that means every time you spit, you're literally leaving your genetic blueprint behind. But it goes deeper than that. Your saliva also contains lysozyme, which is a natural antibiotic that can kill harmful bacteria. It has lactoferrin, which boosts immune function. It contains epidermal growth factor, which promotes tissue regeneration. So, when your grandmother spit on that cut to, quote, make it better, she wasn't being gross. She was applying a complex cocktail of healing compounds, if you want to say, that actually work. And, the phrase lick your wounds exists because it's scientifically accurate. Studies have shown that oral wounds heal approximately twice as fast as skin wounds, which I definitely always remember growing up as a kid because I used to always bite my lip or bite my tongue. And my dad would always just say, your mouth is the fastest healing part of the body, which I would just repeat to myself because I'd be like, don't worry, it's going to heal, it's going to heal, it's going to heal. And then, of course, we wake up the next morning and it suddenly doesn't hurt as much. And of course, back to the tears, I already talked about the different chemical compounds in it, similar to like fear sweat, stress sweat, and even exercise sweat. It's really different. Hence, saying or hearing the saying "I smell fear." This is because your tears are literally carrying the biochemical signature of whatever emotion produced them, much like the sweat. And from a magical perspective, this validates everything pretty much understood about using tears for sympathetic magic. You're not just adding salt water to your spell, you're adding the actual chemical essence of the emotion or emotional state, at least, that you want to work with. And recent research has also discovered that emotional tears contain leucine and kephalin, which is a natural painkiller. So when you cry it out and feel better afterward, that's not just psychological. You're literally producing and absorbing natural pain relief. Your body knows how to heal emotional wounds through through the production of specific chemical compounds. Now, urine might seem like the grossest topic, but scientifically, it's pretty fascinating. Your kidneys process your entire blood supply multiple times a day, filtering out waste products, but also concentrating those various compounds. So the result is a liquid that contains a concentrated snapshot of your entire internal chemistry. And morning urine, of course, is particularly potent because it's been concentrating in your bladder all night while your body was in regenerative sleep mode. And it contains higher concentrations of hormones, cellular waste products, and what biochemists call metabolic markers, essentially a chemical record of your body's overnight healing and regeneration process. From a magical perspective, this makes really perfect sense. If you're using urine for scrying or divination, you're reading the chemical story of your body's wisdom. These old practitioners who called it the water of the body's wisdom weren't just being poetic, they were more or less being scientifically accurate. And here's where the science gets really interesting for at least us magical people. Every cell in your body generates a small electromagnetic field. And your bodily fluids carry these electromagnetic signatures. When you use your saliva, tears, or urine in magical work, you're not just adding physical substances, you're adding your personal electromagnetic signature to the working. Now, quantum field theory, yes, I'm going to go there, not for long, but quantum field theory suggests that information can be stored and transmitted through water molecules in ways we're only beginning to understand. So, the famous water memory experiments by Jacques Benveniste, ben, oh, whatever, well, controversial. Suggests that water can retain and transmit information even after the original substance is diluted beyond detection. Whether or not you buy into the quantum explanations of the electromagnetic thing, the reality is it's undeniable. Your bodily fluids carry your personal energetic signature in measurable scientific ways. When you use them in magical work, you're creating that connection that goes beyond symbolic action. Okay, so finally on the sciencey topic, your body contains pheromones. Yes, yummy, yummy pheromones, chemical signals that can influence the behavior and emotions of others. Human pheromones are much more subtle than those of other animals, but they're definitely real and measurable. Your saliva, tears, and other secretions carry these chemical messages, and this gives a scientific basis for magical practices involving the bodily fluids. When you use your saliva to anoint something, you want someone else to be attracted to you, maybe. You're applying a chemical signal that can influence their subconscious response. When you add tears to magic aimed at emotional connection, you're using substances that carry actual emotional chemistry. Now, skeptics might argue that any effects from the body fluid magic are just placebo responses, but you know what? If you believe it works, it works. Here's the thing, even if some of the effects are psychological, that doesn't make them less real or less powerful. The placebo effect is actually evidence of how powerful the mind body connection is, not proof that something is fake. Because in the end, at least for me, and this may be way more of a chaos magic perspective, but if it's all fake in the end and it still works, who the fuck cares? It works. Plus, there are measurable physical properties in bodily fluids that work regardless of belief. The antibacterial properties, obviously, they don't care if they or whether or not you believe in them, they're there. The stress hormones in tears or sweat, they have measurable effects whether you think they're magical or not. And those electromagnetic signatures in urine exist independently of your beliefs about magic. The beautiful thing about understanding the science behind this body fluid magic is that it bridges the gap between this kind of ancient wisdom that's kind of always existed and modern knowledge. You don't have to choose between being scientifically informed and magically empowered. You can appreciate both the biochemistry reality of what you're working with and the energetic principles that make it effective. So, your saliva really does contain your genetic essence and healing compounds. Your tears really do carry the chemical signature of your emotions, and in your urine really does contain concentrated information about your body's internal processes. The magic isn't separate from the science, at least not with body fluid magic. You know, at least in my practice, I often bridge the two, most often just for my own pleasures. And in the end, I find, this actually makes my connection to even the most folkish of ways of my practice to be more accurate and even potent. So when you use body fluid magic with this understanding, you're not relying on blind faith or ancient superstition. You're working with sophisticated biotechnology that your body produces naturally using principles that are validated by modern research, applying techniques that have been tested and refined over thousands of years of human experimentation. So, after all that, in a culture that profits from your insecurity, self acceptance is a radical and, yes, political act. In a religious system that depends on your shame, honoring your body is revolutionary. When you recognize your own body fluids as sacred, you're refusing to participate in the economy of spiritual insufficiency that keeps you dependent and controllable. And this is why body fluid magic feels so transgressive to some people who really grew up in a Christian background. It's not just crossing a ritual boundary, it's crossing a psychological boundary that was designed to keep you small, dependent, and really ashamed. When you work with your own pee as a sacred substance, you've broken some seriously deep programming around self worth and spiritual authority. And at first, body fluid magic might feel like a rebellion against religious programming. And, that's fine. Rebellion is a necessary stage of breaking free from conditioning, no matter what it is. But ultimately, this practice moves beyond rebellion, it's a reclamation. You're not just rejecting what you were taught about your body, you're actively reclaiming this wisdom about the sacred nature of your physical existence. And you're connecting with thousands of years, really. Seriously, think about it. Thousands of years of human spiritual practice that honored the body as divine. And you're tapping into ways of working with the sacred that predate organized religion and will outlast it, surely. You're joining a lineage of practitioners who understood that the most powerful magic often comes from the most intimate sources. And this is what the future of spirituality could look like for some people who are breaking free from religious conditioning. Practices that honor your body, techniques that, recognize your inherent power, and systems that support your sovereignty instead of undermining it. Body fluid magic represents a return to spiritual technologies that empower you instead of controlling you. And really, the thing about body fluid magic is that it's completely yours. No one else can take it away from you, regulate it, tax it, or control your access to it. Your body produces these sacred substances every day, regardless of what any institution thinks about it. Your saliva carries your essence whether or not anyone blesses it. Your tears contain emotional alchemy whether or not anyone validates it. in your urine holds a concentrated life force, whether or not anyone approves of it. This is profane magic in its purest form. Magic that finds the sacred in the earthly, the divine in the physical, and the holy in what religion called unholy. It's magic that says your flesh is not fallen, but sacred. Your natural functions are not shameful, but they're really, really, really fucking powerful. Okay, so with all that, I hope that this discussion, or if you should call it another tangent of the week, leaves you with something useful, even if it's just one little thing. Again, I want to thank all of you who support the show and also left a rating. I honestly was not paying attention to the ratings like at all until it hit me when I was looking at my dashboard. So thank you. Thank you for everyone who left a very kind rating. And I am excited to hear any feedback in the poll this week and hope you can chime in to participate. I would love to start having that be more of a regular thing and actually talk about some of the things that you guys want to hear. And with that, wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.